What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with more Batman stuff, right? Batman the Imposter. We will actually have this finished tomorrow, so Friday this should be done. So here's the thing. So what we do is we basically pick up with kind of like, to a degree, the origin of Batman. I mean, the origin of Batman is like universal, right? Thomas and Martha Wayne are shot in front of Bruce, and then, how it unfolds from there is relative to the story. But the thing about this is that we actually end up having Leslie Tompkins, who was the initial therapist for Bruce Wayne, kind of running over the case notes from when she had originally seen him. And one of the things we learn is that in the aftermath of Bruce Wayne's parents dying, that in boarding school, he found himself just getting into a series of fights, right? Conflicts, different things like that. Now, when it comes to kids usually operating in that capacity, it's usually like an external form of basically expressing how they're feeling on the inside. So if they're angry, then they'll express that through anger, right? So they'll basically just get into fights, conflicts, things along those lines. What's interesting here is when she asks him, why did you get into a fight with them? The response is because they think they're better than everybody, right? Like all these people, these kids at this prep school, they think they're better than everybody else. And so as she sees it from where she's sitting, right off the bat, he's got social withdrawal, oppositional defiance disorder, PTSD, a lack of empathy, and acute anxiety along with OCD. So the kid's got a host of things that he's basically struggling with. What's interesting about this is like the oppositional defiant disorder, because it's one of those things where he's kind of like, those people think they're better than other people. But the response of Leslie is, that may very well be true, Bruce, but we have to keep you in the status quo, right? Our goal here is to basically make you like everybody else. And so it's one of those things where if this is left unchecked, he could end up developing antisocial personality disorder. And that would make him different than people, which of course on a societal level, we know isn't really something that we tolerate too much. So in order to ensure that he remains like everybody else, she basically ends up saying like, this is something that needs to be treated. Now, the problem with this is that Alfred is basically at his wit's end, right? Alfred's kind of looking at this from the perspective of like, I don't know how to do this anymore. I can't handle this anymore, right? The kid starts tearing stuff up in the house, just losing his mind. And what's really interesting about this is Bruce Wayne in this story reacts to his parents' death the way you would genuinely expect him to, right? The way you would expect really any kid to react in that capacity, right? Losing your parents in the blink of an eye, like right in front of you, witnessing such a heinous and violent action, that would drive anybody crazy, right? It would get, put any kid in the point where they basically just start expressing themselves through rage and anger. The staff are absolutely terrified of him. And it gets to the point where Alfred's just like, is there any way we can just medicate this kid and call it a day, right? That's one of the things about this. Like, I grew up in the 1990s. Well, technically I was born in 84, but I'm basically a 90s kid. For those of you guys who aren't familiar with that, the 90s were the decade of medication, right? Like every problem with a kid could be solved with medication, largely because parents just didn't know what they were doing, so they turned to the easiest solution. Right? That's kind of us as people. We want the greatest reward for the least amount of work possible. And so that was just kind of the thing that everybody did in the 90s, was just medicate everybody. But in the end, what ends up happening is that because Leslie Tompkins is like, I'm not going to just medicate this kid because you're a lazy butler, because this is just a little more than you can handle. The result is that Bruce Wayne is basically shipped off to a military school in Russia, and then in turn, Alfred basically quits, right? He just like leaves on the spot. And so in a lot of ways, Leslie Tompkins carries this around as a personal failure. She sees it as something that she had basically screwed up, or she wasn't able to bring Bruce back from this edge that he was on. And ultimately, it led him down the path that he's currently on. Now, the funny thing about this, and what's really interesting, is that if the antisocial personality disorder of Bruce Wayne has led him to become Batman, which in turn has made a more marked change, has basically improved Gotham City in a way that anybody without antisocial personality was able to do, does that mean it's a bad thing? And that's what's interesting, right? Like, is something a bad thing if the net benefit of it is a good thing, right? That's kind of what's interesting there, right? Do the ends justify the means, in other words? In a lot of ways, yes, right? I mean, that's kind of how we are as people. We don't care what happens to the cow, so long as the steak tastes good when we get it. I mean, we'll say we care, but like our actions show that we basically don't. And so it's just one of those things where it's just kind of really interesting with regards to like this philosophical perspective. But again, when she ends up talking to him, of course, he's all kind of scarred up as Bruce Wayne normally is, right? All cut up and all that kind of stuff. One of the things he establishes is that because Wesker Capital is in a lot of ways the financial benefactor of Gotham City, one of the things he realized here is that they have eyes and ears everywhere. So being able to access their surveillance system is paramount. The problem with this is that once he gets in there, of course, he's got to overcome the guards, because remember, this version of Batman doesn't have the same kind of stealth and guile that we're normally used to seeing in DC Comics. Instead, it's a more realistic portrayal of his character. Dude walks in through the front door and just starts beating the hell out of everybody. right? Just straight up beating everybody up. The problem with this is that while he is able to gain access to their surveillance system, ultimately he doesn't really put one of the guys down for the count, and he ends up basically hitting the button that essentially alerts like the giant bodyguard guy who shows up, and a fight ensues. Batman's overpowered, and then that's effectively it. Batman ends up getting the absolute tar beaten out of him. Now, what's really also interesting here is in the last video, we talked about the name of Wesker, and we talked about how Wesker is one of those guys who basically ends up becoming the ventriloquist in the main DC line of comics. What's really cool here is that Arnold Wesker is actually the son, the one that's kind of been talking to himself, and sort of rambling to himself, different things like that. And what it basically does is it kind of points in the direction that he will eventually become the ventriloquist. We're not really given any absolute certainty here, but I mean, he literally holds a ventriloquist doll. Now, the way that works, at least as I understand it from my knowledge of the ventriloquist and the stories that I've read, is that Arnold Wesker is basically a guy with multiple personality disorder. And as a result of that, one of those personalities manifests in the form of the ventriloquist doll. It's kind of his baseline desires for like violence and destruction and so on, right? Everything he wishes he was is manifested in how the ventriloquist doll talks. So maybe not necessarily multiple personality disorder in like the traditional sense, but you guys understand what I'm saying. Now, the funny thing is that where Bruce Wayne encounters him, he could have overcome it, right? Like literally Wesker asked Bruce Wayne, like, will you kill my father? And the response of Bruce just doesn't come. He never really says anything. He just ultimately leaves. And when Leslie asks him about that, the response here is, I mean, to a degree, he kind of felt bad for him. He doesn't really say as much, but it's just one of those things where it's kind of like, he could have just pummeled him, right? He could have just beat him up, or he could have just said no or something like that. Instead, he simply just leaves. And so what you get here is a really interesting situation where you jump back to the moment when Blair Wong shows up on the doorstep of Bruce Wayne at Wayne Manor and starts asking him about like the motorcycles and all that kind of stuff, right? Everything that had been going on in the last video where like there were like 60 some odd motorcycles that had been impounded. And one of the things that she had picked up on is that while pretty much all of the identification numbers, the VINs, were essentially gone, there was no indication of who they actually belonged to, they did find a serial number tied to one of the tires that basically showed that the motorcycle was purchased by Wayne Industries. And there's no reason to believe all the others weren't as well. So if for no other reason than to track down a lead, and while she doesn't really suspect Bruce Wayne per se, a kind of interesting bit of a romance forms between the two of them, right? Not in the sense that like, I mean, well, I guess, not immediate. Instead, it's just kind of one of those general things where he's kind of like, look, if I think of anything or if I come up with anything, I'll give you a call, right? I'll talk to you. Now, one of the things to know is that this is Bruce Wayne being manipulative, right? He knows that Wong has information that he needs, but he knows that Wong won't readily give it to him because Bruce Wayne's not working with her on the case. And if he were a suspect, she wouldn't give him information that would make it easier for him to dodge the police. And so there's just no real way for him to get that info. And so what he basically calculates here is the idea that the best way to get that info is to basically manipulate her, right? To use her for his own ends, to kind of pump her for information. Now, the funny thing is she kind of does that to a degree, but the two of them basically end up meeting up for lunch. And once he has this conversation with her and saying, hey, look, so here's the thing, right? I was asking my people to look for any kind of discrepancies in our import logs or anything like that. And he says, 18 months ago, we had a missing shipment container that was never accounted for. And it apparently had 25 motorcycles in it. Now, when she asked the question, why didn't you contact the cops? He's like, I mean, it's one missing container out of 2,200. We're not really that concerned about it, especially if all it had in it were motorcycles, right? It's not really a super important thing to us. If it had like microchips that could launch nuclear missiles across the world, sure, we would probably tell someone, right? But until then, we didn't necessarily have a reason to. Now, one of the funny things is where she asked him the question, hey, like, why are you even coming to me and telling me all this in the first place? He's like, well, I looked you up, right? I got curious and I just kind of did some poking around on you. I know people who know people. They were able to give me a little bit of background information on you, and I realized how much we had in common. And where she hits on this idea that like both of us saw our parents killed in front of each other, because that's Blair Wong's story. She witnessed the death of her parents in front of her. That Bruce is kind of like, no, I was talking about the fact that we both dropped out of Yale, that you spent time in Brazil, that I spent a few years there as well, that kind of a thing, and just kind of manipulating her here, right? I mean, the reality is she hit the nail on the head, right? I mean, for him, that's the thing that can be used to unify them to a degree, but he can allude to it by simply saying, well, we have a lot in common. And that where Bruce Wayne's story is just well-known information, even within the people of Gotham and really even just around the world, Blair Wong's story is very similar to that. So by allowing her to draw those lines and then saying, no, that's not what I was talking about about it all, and then making her feel a sense of guilt. Now she feels a sense of owing him. And that's when he's like, no, I mean, it's cool, right? You can let me buy you breakfast. That's where the charm kicks in. That's the nature of antisocial personality disorder. That people with that mental illness, if they use it in the most extreme degree, are incredibly charming, but ridiculously manipulative, right? Like they will use you for their own ends and then get rid of you as soon as they're done, right? So that's the thing, right? It's not one of those things where it's like, well, I mean, okay, I mean, that's fine, but you can pay me back by like giving me all your case notes. It's weaseling in, right? It's saying like, you can let me buy you breakfast, right? And the more they spend time together and the more they talk, the more that a kind of attraction begins to grow between the two of them. Now, one thing to understand is that love has a mind of its own, right? There's no controlling it. There's no categorizing, quantifying, and keeping love isolated to this one part of your life. So I won't go as far as to say that like Bruce Wayne realized his heart was 3 sizes too small and it got bigger, right? He's not the Grinch. But I will say that the affection he feels for Wong moves away from like, she's an asset that I can use to attain information, and actually starts to grow into, I think I'm falling in love with her. So much so that the two of them actually spend the night together. And so one of the things that goes on, which is really kind of crazy here, is basically, of course, she kind of asks him like, where did you get this scar from? Where'd you get that scar from? And where the reality is like he was cut, right? Or he was like hit with a 2x4 or something like that. He can't tell her, well, when I was running around in the middle of the night last night and I was beating up criminals, one of them slashed me, right? It's just one of those car accident, right? Like, it was a skiing accident. I mean, Blair Wong's no idiot, but it's also one of those things where like when we're in that position, right, as people, we like the game gets played, right? So like, sure, she knows that like he's kind of full of crap, but she's also going along with it because she wants to believe that it's true, right? She doesn't want to believe this guy could potentially be Bruce Wayne. It may also be she just genuinely believes him. And so he actually ends up telling Leslie Tompkins that one of the things that he's not necessarily proud of is the fact that he is essentially manipulating her. But what he says is the mission is all that really matters, and it's all that ever mattered. At the end of the day, she's just a means to an end. And so one of the things he realizes is that by going through this and basically downloading all of her case files, that there are striking similarities among those people who were killed by the imposter Batman that he hadn't picked up on, right? Some of these are that 2 of the imposter's victims were cellmates, 8 out of the 11 victims overlapped their sentences at Blackgate Prison. The victims were all killed in a 3-mile radius, which, as Batman describes it, is enormous in terms of Gotham's density unless you have access to a surveillance network. And he says, but there was one more staggering pattern. 9 out of the 11 imposter victims were sentenced by the same judge, a guy named Alex McCart. And so, of course, Batman ends up tracing down Alex McCart because while he wouldn't go as far as to say that, like, he thinks that this judge, right, is a guy who's dressed up as Batman beating people up because he doesn't fit the MO. He's an older guy. He doesn't have the strength to overpower people who are 20 years younger than him and twice his size, right? He just doesn't quite have the ability to do that. But, you know, Batman comes to this from the perspective that, like, he might know something about it. And so what we end up learning here, we kind of get a little more information involving, like, Gordon and all those different guys. And one of the things that we learn is that because of the fact that Jim Gordon and Batman were working together, and Batman was basically a vigilante who in turn was snatching up criminals and then handing them over to the Gotham City Police Department, that essentially the city had ruled, or at least the courts had ruled, that their civil rights were violated by Batman. And so what it meant is that none of the rulings that were handed down by Alex McCart could stand. On top of that, what they ended up discovering is that 5 judges were basically on the payroll from the 3 crime families in Gotham City. So what it meant is that between these crooked judges, along with Batman violating people's civil rights, that essentially all these different cases were just overturned. Just all these criminals that had been busted were all released back out there again. And that Jim Gordon himself, his career was destroyed. He was out, right? Like literally ran out of Gotham City. And that's why we don't see him here, because he's basically gone, right? He's out of the picture. Now, beyond that, once Bruce is able to essentially start using the information gained from Wesker's surveillance, and Wong is able to do the same thing, what they do is they realize a couple different things. One, Wong realizes that basically Batman has been using the sewer systems to travel around Gotham City. We already knew that, but what Batman realizes is the imposter's doing the exact same thing, and in fact, he's actually using sewer systems that no one's supposed to know about. Now, if you guys remember the last video that we did, the only person that seemingly has that kind of information is Otis, right? The rat catcher. And so what Batman realizes is that Otis has seemingly been helping the imposter Batman. Now, here's the thing. We'll talk about this here in a second because there's a little more going on than it seems. But of course, where Batman basically races off to catch Otis, ultimately, the cops get there before he does. And because the police suspect him as either the imposter Batman, or at least as far as they're concerned, Batman, who's basically killing people, or they believe he has some kind of information, they of course end up arresting capturing him and basically taking him away. And so at that point, what you get is this crazy situation, which is really just a page out of the Dark Knight, when Wong is like, keep your eyes out for Batman, because if this guy has information that Batman uses, this guy could be the way that we catch him. And so Batman, as a guy who kills, is going to be looking to either kill this guy or at the very least, get him out of our custody. And so that's where things are nuts, is because literally Batman just sends this wrecking ball down onto like the police cars and just smashes pretty much all of them. And so where Wong is able to like get out of the rubble, right, able to like finally find Batman, where he's basically there trying to free Otis, Batman essentially knocks the gun out of her hand and then kicks her, right, sends her flying. And this is kind of a big deal here, because at that point he basically grabs Otis and then he starts interrogating him, right, like smashing his head in water, different things like that, like who's the imposter Batman and so on. But Otis doesn't understand, and it's actually really, really sad. Otis doesn't understand because in his mind, Batman was the guy who saved his life. He's the guy who saved him from people who were going to try to kill him. And so in his mind, him and Batman were basically friends, right? Like they were great friends. Like Batman was the guy that saved him. Now, the reality here is that they're not friends, and they were never friends. But Otis sees them as the two of them being friends because it's really just an act of desperation, right? You know, Batman's the only person that really paid any attention to Otis. And so because of that, he's like, we're friends now, right? That's not true. And again, that's where things get crazy, because we're gonna end up finding out that like the whole situation with Otis and Batman is a lot more interesting and a lot more wrapped up than it initially appears to be. But beyond that, what ends up happening here is that Blair Wong is just kind of like, enough is enough, right? Like at this point, Batman has literally attacked us, right? Just a face, like a front-on attack. It was different when he was like killing what were basically criminals, and when we wouldn't necessarily turn a blind eye to it, he wasn't really attacking us head on. So we would just kind of investigate this the way cops investigate it. But once Batman attacked the cops and it was done with people being able to record it, the cops looked totally inept. Now they have to save face. And that's where Wong basically goes to the evidence lockup and ends up picking the lock, grabbing a gun that effectively belongs to other people. And then in turn, when her partner Hatcher shows up, he's like, what in the world are you doing? Like, you're not supposed to be here, you know? And she's like, I'm getting ready to go to war. Like, do you want to join me? And it's actually, I mean, this is really what they're going to do. It's not the worst move ever. Use guns from evidence lockup because it just wouldn't be traced back to them, right? As long as they keep their fingerprints off of it. It's not like it's a department issue firearm that they're using. The serial numbers cannot be traced back to them as the actual owner. So basically they could just pull off some crazy stunt and nobody would be any the wiser to the fact that it was actually them. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Again, I love this. I can't wait to record or at least release the final part of this, because the final part is just absolutely amazing. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.